Edexcel Economics, Paper 1, Microeconomics Paper 2022 in this scenario, and let's get started with it. I don't know why it didn't say 2022 at the start of it, but you just have to trust me. But it also does say it there. But yeah, let's get started. So section A, and let's go straight to the question. Ceteris paribus. Okay, that's a bit of a weird thing to say, but the most likely consequence of the above data is that Disney Plus will experience an increase in its... So what this means is assuming Ceteris paribus. Of course, you should know what Ceteris paribus means. All other things held constant whilst one variable changes. Okay, let's see what is given us in this table. So Disney Plus, nothing really there. And then what's it given us in the rest of it? So Disney Plus subscribers in millions and chronologically increasing in time, and also the subscribers are increasing in millions. So it's asking us what is the most likely consequence of Disney Plus subscribers increasing in millions. I'll probably, because we're assuming Ceteris paribus as well, something like an increase in profits, increase in revenue, increase in sales, something like that. So let's see what options we have. We have fixed costs, income elasticity of demand, price elasticity of demand, revenue. So right now I can already tell the answer is revenue, but why is it not the rest of them? So firstly, fixed costs. Of course, what are fixed costs? Remember, fixed costs do not change with output, therefore it cannot actually be fixed costs. Maybe it's variable costs, it could have been. But then income elasticity and price elasticity demand, we just basically have no information about any of that, so it's not going to be that. But yeah, the answer here would be D, and let's move on to the next question. So this is a 1 mark question. Whenever there's multiple choice, there's usually a 4 marker after it, and I haven't actually looked at this paper, so let's see if there is. And look at that. This is why I've done too many past papers, spent too much time in A-level economics. I can just already predict questions. Okay, well, looks like a very nice question. Supply and demand, draw a supply and demand diagram to show the likely effect of a change in the number of subscribers on the market equilibrium for Disney Plus services. So always start with these questions, labeling the axes, so price and quantity. That should be a mark there. Now, what's happening? What do we say? Again, we've already analysed the table. It's much faster. We can become very efficient at this. So, Disney Plus subscribers are obviously increasing from 10 to 50 million. What does that mean? That is obviously affecting the demand side of things. So, demand is increasing for Disney Plus services. So, that is what we need to show. How do you show an increase in demand? You shift demand out from D, so demand, to demand plus 1. Oh, and that is not the best line I've drawn. So, demand plus 1, and again it's talking about the market equilibrium price, etc. So let's just label this up, and this is all we would need. So PE to now P1, I might add a little annotation there to show the increase in price, then QE to now Q1. So we have overall an increase in price and an increase in quantity demanded, and that might be the easiest 4 marks you ever get. But just make sure the question is specifically on market equilibriums. So I'm just going to label up the market equilibriums. In the exam, I'll probably do something like this: original equilibrium, after equilibrium. But you don't actually have to do that. But yeah, that is enough for 4 marks. And let's move on to question 2. Let's hope all questions are as easy as this. But okay, so let's go straight to the question. 2 marks. It looks like a calculate question. The price of sweetened drinks increases by 5%. So straight away, I haven't even read the question. It sounded like a PED question. Ceteris paribus, calculate the percentage change. Okay, no, I'm just wrong. So calculate the percentage change in quantity demanded for sweetened drink, and I'm advised to show my workings. So we have a PED here and we have a XED here. So just for revision sake for you guys, I am going to write out the PED formula. It's percentage change, triangle me change by the way. Percentage change in quantity demanded divided by percentage change in price. So that actually is a PED question. What information are we given here? We're given here that the PED for sweetened drinks is 1.37 and the price of sweetened drinks increases 5%, so it's given us 2 of those values, and it's basically asking us to work out that. It's asking us to work out the percentage change in quantity demanded, and it also says here, calculate the percentage change in quantity demanded. Now, that is some very simple maths, and let's work this out. How do you do that? You do 1.37 times 5, and that would give us, no, mental maths is not great, so I'll have to use a calculator, and that is apparently 6.85, and I'll do minus, and remember the main thing here, always include the units, because it is a percentage, since if you look at this, it's percentage change in quantity demanded, so it's minus 6.5%. Okay, so that is 2 marks bagged, and let's move on to the next question. It looks similar, but I'm guessing this is XED. But the price of sweetened drinks increases by 5%. Calculate the percentage change in quantity demanded. Okay, the reason why I guessed it was XED, because firstly, we're given an XED value, and so we're probably going to have to use it. And also now on second reading of the question, it says the price of sweetened drinks versus the quantity demanded of bottled water. So that is very sneaky and challenging question. And of course, for your guys' revision sake, so when I write this out, what is the XCD formula? You try to tell me before I write it. So it's percentage change in quantity demanded for good A, so that is whatever good that is, divided by percentage change in percentage in price for good B. So now let's just import the data we already have. So we already have the XCD value, which is here, which is 0.63. We're given the price of sweetened drinks. So the price of sweetened drink, that aligns with that part of the formula. So price of sweetened drinks increases 5%, so pretty much same thing again. This is why with section A, if you're not getting 100%, I would have reflect and put a bit more work in, because it is very, very easy. So 0.63 times 5, using a calculator, that would give us a value of 3.15, and again it is a percentage, so make sure you include the percentage sign. That is 4 marks back there. So let's have a shot at this. Using the data on page 4, which of the following is most likely? So this is about obviously the XCD part of things, and this by the PED. Let's start with the PED. So a decrease in the price of sweetened drinks. Let me just quickly remind myself what the PED of sweetened drinks are. So it's minus 1.37. So 1.37 of course means the demand for this good is elastic. So again, little reminder, between 0 and 1 is inelastic, and anything greater than 1 is elastic. So now let's put in the scenario. So a decrease in the price of sweetened drinks. What do we expect from a good with elastic demand? Of course, if it's a decrease in price, consumers are very responsive, so there's going to be an increase in revenue since there's going to be more sales, etc, etc. So we can rule out A and B, but now let's grab the XCD value, which is plus 0.63. So with regards to XCD, since it is a positive value, this would be a substitute. So basically anything above 0 with regards to XCD substitutes, and as you can imagine, anything below 0 is a complement. So we have a substitute here, which means the answer must be, therefore, D, because it's not a complement and it's not any of these two, so it must therefore be D. And yeah, it does fit the bill. So an increase in the price, an increase in the revenue, and sweetened drinks and bottled drinks are substitutes. And honestly, even if you knew nothing about elastic and inelastic demand, you probably guess that by just common knowledge. So if there's a decrease in price, there's probably going to be an increase in revenue, because people know that when prices decrease, you want to buy more. And sweetened drinks and bottled drinks, it's not the hardest one to work out, though. And that is 5 out of 5 marks for this question 2. Been a very easy section here so far, and let's move on to the next question. Ooh, we've got a lot of information here, and let's see what's asking us. Draw an externality diagram, this is a good one, to show the likely impact of sewage discharge on the local tourist industry. Sewage discharge, and let me just have a read of this. Pollution. Okay, so it's going to be negative. So obviously for Edexcel, technically there are only 2 externality diagrams you should know, which are positive and negative. If you watch YouTubers that are not Edexcel specific, they will have taught you 4 diagrams, but on the Edexcel spec you only need to know a negative production externality diagram and a positive externality diagram. So let's get started with this negative externality diagram. So cost slash benefit on this axis, and quantity on the y-axis, or output, whatever you want to call it. So let's get started with this question. So supply equals marginal private costs, of course, and then let's draw a demand curve, which is demand equals marginal private benefit, and since it's a negative production externality diagram, marginal private benefit is also equal to marginal social benefit. And what about it makes it a negative production externality diagram or a negative externality diagram? It is the marginal social cost curve is above. And now the main thing in an essay question, the main way you're going to pick up the marks is the labels and using the labels. But here, obviously, you need to label it up just for the marks. And so, what does this point represent? This point, of course, represents the market equilibrium. So this is QE, I'm going to label this. Then MSE, what does this point now represent? This point represents the socially efficient equilibrium. So what does the gap between QSE and QE represent? It represents the overproduction. So since this is talking about pollution, it's talking about, I haven't actually even read the extract, but lots of pollution, I think fish, water, people are drinking polluted water. The social cost of society is higher than the private cost. So the reason we produce at the market equilibrium, and we don't need to know this is just revising, you don't need to know this for this question specifically, but the reason we produce at the market equilibrium is due to when private producers produce, when firms produce, they only think about their private costs and not external cost to society. And remember, what is social cost formula? Social cost is external costs plus private costs. So since private firms, they're selfish, they only think about their own costs and not the cost to society, they overproduce. This is where the government intervened. They sometimes entered the market with a tax. Why? Because this is a too high level of production, and they want to push production back to QSE, which is obviously the socially efficient equilibrium. And what does this gap, what does the overproduction between QE and QSE cause? It causes welfare loss. Now, my main rule for welfare loss, to make sure you never mess it up, you go from the market to equilibrium, which is where supply equals demand, and you go up or down to your social curve. And of course, in this scenario, the social curve is above, so you go from there just to there, and that is now your welfare loss triangle. And then for this diagram, I usually don't even draw them on, but you don't even need it for the marks here, but you can draw on the prices. And don't worry if you've learnt the MSE curve like this. It's classic where Edexcel teachers sometimes teach it like it's completely fine for this question. Just make sure you get your welfare losses right, label the curves right, and everything is still rosy. Okay, now moving on to the multiple choice question. So which of the following is the most likely effect of a 180k fine? Now this means we should probably read the stimulus because I have no idea what this 180k fine. So a company that provides drinking water, treats water waste, being fined 180,000. What? And I'm just gonna quickly go back and read the option. What is the most likely effect of the 180,000 fine? I haven't actually even read the stimulus, but a fine is probably not going to increase the market failure. It'll probably reduce the market failure. Increase profits for water company. Again, a fine is very likely not to do that. Reduce external costs, I would agree. Reduce government failure, maybe, but I'll probably not agree as much, so I'm going to read the stimulus to make sure it's reduce external costs. Yeah, so the charge related to illegal discharge. It polluted the river. So that basically what they're doing, they're putting a fine on the firm, so it is definitely external costs. Is that the classic, when you put a tax in this diagram, you can show it by MPC plus tax. Obviously I'm just illustrating this for explaining purposes. What does this mean? It means that the private cost is now at the same point at the socially efficient equilibrium, meaning there's no overproduction in society. But yeah, the answer for that multiple choice question would be C. Okay, moving on to the next question. Has been quite an easy section A, so I expect these two questions to be quite hard. Okay, nice little game theory. It looks like, so draw a game theory, a two firm, two outcome game theory model to show why chicken suppliers may have colluded. Okay, so let's get started with this question. This is usually quite a confusing question for quite a lot of students, and just game theory, it confuses quite a lot of people, but let's try digging deep and make this as simple as possible for you. But okay, so they received a 107.9 million fine, but I don't think that's going to be very relevant in the game theory diagram. But then this looks like it's going to be very relevant. So they gained Pilgrim's Pride, I think that's the name, is thought to gain at least 361 million in total revenue from the collusion. So since they're colluding, they're probably setting a high price, and that is what I'm going to put for my figure for the high price. So let's sketch out this game theory diagram. Okay, so it's probably not going to be the cleanest diagram, but it should do the job. Okay, and that should be good enough. Box that off. I guess anything like that will do. So of course in this we will have revenue, whatever is in, they don't really care, but that's meant to be $1. Okay, so revenue in dollars, and then always remember the revenue, and that's going to be in dollars. Pretend that's $1. And then we have high price, and in the question it has not given us any like indication of what high price is. You probably set whatever, you probably make it up, but I don't think it's not going to be needed for the marks basically. So high prices here, and then obviously in the other columns low prices. And who was colluding? It was Tyson Foods. So I'm going to put Pilgrim's Pride actually. Pilgrim's Pride and Tyson Foods. So obviously you need to roll these firms on to show how the game theory diagram works. But always remember, so the firm on the left is going to represent the price on the left as well, and the firm on top is going to represent the price on the right. So obviously the high price was in terms of revenue, they were getting 361 million. So I'm just going to write 361 here, and that's if they both selected the high price, and that's of course if both firms colluded, which of course as the question stem states they did collude. And I'm just going to go with the low price. Obviously this is the Nash equilibrium. For this question you just have to make up figures, like this is just as long as your low price is lower than your high price and it's the same value, that's all you're going to need for the mark. Now let's fill in this box. Let's think about it. If Pilgrim's Pride set a low price, and if you look at Tyson's Food, they have a high price. So Pilgrim's Pride have a low price, Tyson's Food still have that high price. So basically Pilgrim's Pride have cheated. What is likely to happen? So they undercut this firm, and remember the game theory represents oligopolistic firms. What's likely to happen to the revenue for Pilgrim's Pride? The revenue for Pilgrim's Pride is likely to increase, and the revenue for Tyson Foods is likely to decrease. So we might have something like 400 million, and then for Tyson Foods something like 100 million. And for this box, of course, same scenario. It's just that in this scenario, Tyson Foods cheats instead of Pilgrim's Pride, 400 not 4,000. Thus, of course, oligopolistic market consumers substitute away. Tyson Foods gains a lot of that quantity demanded. So that is enough for 4 marks. We'll explain the mark breakdown just so you know if a question comes up on this in the future, you know basically what the marks are for. So of course, the firm on the left represents the prices on the left, whereas the firm on the top represents the prices on the right. Then obviously the high price, you need to make sure these are equal since they would all both be making the same revenue. Same with the low price. The low price of course needs to be lower than the high price, and of course this is what some of you may know as the Nash equilibrium. And then in terms of when one of them undercuts, so these 2 boxes, of course one of them needs to be worse off and one of them needs to be better off in terms of numbers when one of them cheats and undercuts. Okay, and that is 4 out of 4 marks there, and that's the 4 marker done. Like I said, this section here was way too easy, so threw in a bit of a harder question, but let's now move on to the next question. So multiple choice, which one of the following is most closely associated with tacit collusion? So tacit collusion, a really easy way to remember, of course, there's tacit and then there's overt collusion. The way I advise students to remember it is tacit collusion is tactical, it's not illegal basically, whereas overt collusion is the illegal one. So let's see the one that's most closely associated with tacit collusion. Overt sharing of information, of course, tacit, that's overt collusion. Predatory pricing, now predatory pricing, and the next one is price wars. I'll probably not class these as associated with tacit collusion, as predatory pricing and price wars, with predatory pricing, you're literally trying to force the firm out the market. You price lower than like your ABC, for example. On price wars, you're desperately undercutting the other firm to try to steal their market share. And that's, of course, with collusion, you're working together. So it would not be them two either. Unspoken agreements, like I said, it's tactical. If it was spoken agreements, that would also be overt since you're just, you're colluding. But unspoken agreements is definitely tactical, and it's tacit collusion. And that's one of the main features of tacit collusion, which is unspoken agreements. But yeah, so this would be D. And that is question 4 done, and had to get 5 out of 5 on question 4. And let's move on to question 5. Starting with a multiple choice. Which of the following best describes the merger of the makers of Fiat cars and Vauxhall cars? So this is actually a really good question for revision, so let's get started. What is backwards vertical integration? This is where you merge with a supplier. So for example, Fiat or like Vauxhall cars is going to merge with a supplier. An example of this, so we talk about cars, is like, for example, a sort of car company merging with a tyres company. So why do firms do this? As they have more control over their raw materials. For example, car manufacturers cannot produce cars without tyres, and if the tyre company is really slow, they might just find it better just to buy the tyre company, spend a lot of money on it, make it more efficient, and therefore they have control over almost the entire production process. Forward vertical integration then is merging with a distributor. So we're talking about cars. This might be a car company merging with like Auto Trader, like Vauxhall merging with like Auto Trader, or like car showrooms, which help sell the cars. Or an even better example is a farmer buying like a supermarket chain. So now, of course, the farmer makes the goods, but then also he now owns the distribution. Horizontal integration, just like a classic merger, like 302, or the classic ones you hear, where it's basically merging with your competition, merging with companies, firms at the same stage of the production process. And that, of course, does describe what's happening here. Fiat and Vauxhall, they both make cars, and they are merging. But then lastly, we do have organic growth, which is just basically when a firm grows and expands. But then lastly, of course, it's wrong, but internal growth, it is when a firm just grows internally and expands using its own resources. Moving on to the next question, so we have, it's a 2-mark explain question. Explain one type of internal economy scale that newly merged car company may achieve. Now, whenever you talk about internal economy scale, especially in your essay questions, I always suggest these two, which is purchasing and technical. I just believe the easiest to speak about, and you can write the most depth in the chain of analysis. So one, I'm just going to mention purchasing. So I'm going to say, as large a size of order, since, for example, now Fiat and Vauxhall, for example, if they buy the same tyres, they both might have bought 5,000 each previously. Now they can buy 10,000. Larger size of order gives them more bulk buying power, more power to negotiate the price down, therefore overall reducing their long run average cost. And that is that 2-mark done. So as larger size of order increases bargaining power, thus reducing long run average costs. Then lastly, and the last 2-marker for this section A, explain one likely concern that the EU competition authorities may have had about the merger. So at A level, pretty much with regards to regulation, you only really learn about consumers and prices. So the most time with regards like CMA, whatever this is, EU competition authorities, the main concern will be about consumers and the increased market share, probably able to exploit consumers with higher prices, less quality, things like that. But I'm just going to write consumers due to can be exploited with higher prices, and that would be more than enough for 2 marks. And that is 2 out of 2 marks and 5 out of 5 for question 5. And that is section A complete. Moving on to section B in this 2022 paper 1, and let's go straight to the questions. So we have quite a few extracts there. Let's start with the 5 mark question. So this, I can see it straight away. It's one of the rare questions, one of the rare 5 mark questions. If you watch back to my video on 5 markers, I do cover the calculate question. It's one of the most overcomplicated questions out of them all, and if you manage to get a calculate question, just count your blessings, because this is one question where you can save so much time on. All you need to do is do the calculation, no economics theory, do not overcomplicate. Okay, but the question is calculate the 3 firm concentration ratio for branded coffee shop chains, and it's telling us to refer to figure 1. So let's have a look at figure 1. So the 3 firm concentration ratio, of course, meaning the 3 biggest firms in the market, and that would of course be Costa, Starbucks and Cafe Nero. The only way students will drop marks here is other chains, because other chains is of course the largest. Some students will include that in the 3 firm concentration ratio, but of course other chains probably includes thousands of shops, so that's not one firm, so therefore it's the 3 individual independent firm concentration ratio. So the way we calculate the 3 firm concentration ratio is firstly add up the number of shops that Costa, Starbucks and Cafe Nero has. I have finally bought a calculator, so I don't have to use my phone anymore. I don't know whether you can see this, but that does say 4354. And then to work out the 3 firm concentration ratio, we would then divide the number of shops that the 3 biggest have divided by all the shops added together. So then we would add 4354 and then add all the rest together. So then plus 3748, which is of course this one, so we tick that one off, and then the 3 rest of them, which accounts to, so 50 plus 40 is 90, 90 plus 30 is 120, so plus 120, and that would now give us our 3 firm concentration ratio. And of course, since it's a concentration ratio, we are going to give it in a percentage, but that is what the number says, so 0.52, so therefore as a concentration ratio, I'd probably say it's 53%, so just rounding it up from 529 to 53, so they have a 53% concentration ratio. So that is the answer we have gotten, and of course for concentration ratios we would express it as a percentage, so that's 52.96%, and that is the concentration ratio of Costa, Starbucks and Cafe Nero, and that's 5 out of 5 marks. So it's an examine question, 2 factors, so we're going to need 2 different paragraphs here that may cause significant changes in the international price of coffee beans. Okay, before we go and explore the extracts, let's actually break this question down. So it's talking about the price of coffee beans. Now, what are coffee beans? You should know this. Coffee beans, and even without knowing this, you can still answer the question. Coffee beans are, of course, commodities, and they can reword this question so many times. So, like, they can, instead of coffee beans, say oil, wheat, rice, anything basically, any of these commodities, and the answer is the same every single time. When I first read this question, the first thing that sprung to my mind is buffer stocks. As what do we learn in buffer stocks? It's a very small part of the spec, but you should also know this. Commodities, what is their price elasticity of demand, their PED and their PES? They are price inelastic. And let's show this on the diagram. So they're both inelastic in terms of supply and inelastic in terms of demand. And if with a price inelastic in demand and supply, how does this affect their demand and supply curves? Of course, their demand and supply curves will also be inelastic. So very steep supply curve and very steep demand curve. Why are these curves so inelastic? Let's start with supply. So if the price of coffee increased massively, the supply of coffee in that moment of time or in the next few years would not increase anywhere near as proportionally. Why? Since coffee beans, for example, they take years to grow. So even though prices are increasing, quantity supplied will not respond. Therefore, it's that exactly shows what inelastic supply is. Then why are commodities, why is coffee's demand inelastic? Firstly, coffee is associated with lots of habitual behaviour. People to a certain degree are reliant, they're addicted to coffee. And then also the massive lack of substitutes of coffee. Of course, you could mention tea, but tea is not really it's not really a close substitute to coffee, thus meaning coffee has a massive degree of inelastic demand. Also, you factor that in with the low relative price of coffee, it makes the demand fairly inelastic. But now back to answering the question and answering this specific phrase. What leads to there being significant changes in the international price of coffee. Now, for example, let's take this scenario. So coffee is obviously grown and it takes a few years to grow, but maybe one winter, one summer, or like 1 year, there's a very bad harvest, like where the conditions are very poor, meaning that they don't produce as much coffee. Why does this mean that there's going to be a significant change in the price of coffee? Because of course, bad harvest is going to lead to maybe a lot of the coffee beans like die or something like that, so they have less supply of coffee beans. How do we show that on the diagram? We show a lesser supply of coffee beans by shifting in the supply curve from S to S+1. Now, this is exactly why commodities have volatile prices, and that's the exact concept of why we use buffer stocks. But now, as we can see, price increase from P1 to P2. Now, this doesn't look that large as the diagram's quite small, but that is a massive change and a massive shift in the price of coffee, thus leading to, and this proving that concept of these commodities have volatile prices. On the opposite side of the spectrum, such as demand increasing, like for example in new emerging markets like India, for example, average incomes are becoming higher. Therefore, even though coffee is relatively low price compared to their PPPs, their purchasing power parities, it is still relatively expensive. Therefore, with those markets emerging, with those markets growing, they're likely to demand more of this almost luxury good. So yeah, the demand for coffee would increase. So the increase in demand from D to D+1. And as you can see, again, another significant fluctuation, and as the question would word it, a significant change in the international price of coffee, thus showing that these commodities have massive volatility in their prices. Now, of course, this 8-mark question, if you've watched the 8-mark question video, it's broken down into two for each KA, so 2K, 2 application, 2 analysis, and you would 100% picked up, especially with the diagram, especially with all the explanation I've just given you, 100% picked up the 4 knowledge and analysis marks. But now we do need to go to figure 2 to pick up some of those application marks and use them in when we're explaining that chain of analysis. So let's have a look at figure 2, which is this, and how would we use this. And honestly, you've been given a table of statistics. These might be some of the easiest application marks to pick up. Just pick 2 months and either just quote the percentage change, quote the price change, whatever you want to do, and that's very easy, 2 marks there with application. And if you want to just be safe, I would probably, and 100% I'd just quote it twice, so maybe from February to March, or from like a big one here. So quote this next to the change in September, and then just basically just pick 2 separate data points, and it just means it'll secure those 2 marks. And now that is all 6K marks completed, but now of course there are 2 small evaluation marks, so let's try think of an evaluation point for this. And the main thing, and pretty much just for these 2 marks evaluation, all you'd mention is the aim of buffer stocks is to stop the price instability in commodities. Well, the way to word it is reduces price instability. Another one you can always talk about is time frame. So the effects of so the changes in prices definitely massively change between the short run and the long run. So it's another great one to mention. But yeah, that is the 8-marker done. Quite simple and quite a nice 8-mark question. A really good one for practice there, because if something like this comes up again, they might just change it to oil, they might just change it to rice, but it's exactly the same theory and the exact same way you should answer the question. This 10-mark question, which is 6C. So profit maximization is assumed to be the business objective of most firms. I agree with that. So with reference to extract A, assess whether this is the case for coffee shop owners. So it's very clear this question is on business objectives. Now, if I was to think about coffee shops, I kind of think a bit more of an ethical firm maybe, since a lot of them care about, I don't know, just general ethics. And what are some other business objectives that these firms can pursue? So I'm kind of thinking along the lines of profit satisficing, as if you think about your local coffee shop that maybe like a family owns, they're not exactly trying to be Amazon, they're not trying to make massive super profits and live in mansions, they just want to kind of pay their bills, like enjoy the day job and get on with it, like a nice little shop. So profit satisficing, they'll make a certain amount of profit just to keep their firm running, and then not really care too much about profit, and maybe then pursue other objectives like donating to local charities, etc. But then some other objectives I can definitely think about is something like a total opposite of profit satisficing, which is revenue maximizing. And why is that? And I'm thinking about firms like Starbucks, Costa, these large incumbent firms that maybe are trying to force other firms out of the market and pursuing objectives like revenue maximizing. I can also think about things like predatory pricing, which maybe could be mentioned in the extract. But 100% with regards to this question, I am going to have a read of extract A to see what they are referring to, since it could be any of these. And yeah, let's have a look at that. So extract A is here, and yeah, let's see what business objectives these firms are pursuing. So first mention of anything is that consumers are placing quality coffee over convenient location. And yeah, these independent shops, they pursue a luxury experience for customers rather than just like the factory line production of like Starbucks, or like Starbucks is like all these big coffee shops are basically like McDonald's, where you just get your food. It's not really a luxury experience, whereas local coffee shops, they provide you with more of the experience and like better quality. And it mentions how these independents are not doing too well, and they do sometimes go out of business. And then talks about the Coca-Cola takeover, where they're trying to maximise long-term returns to shareholders, which is quite vague, which could be, of course, and it does kind of align with the profit maximisation objective. But then it could, if we're maximising long-term returns, we could maybe in the short term pursue sales max, revenue max, to try and maybe take more market power, and then in the long term move back to profit maximising when we have that established market power. And in conclusion, the extract is not great, but it'll help us pick up those 2 application marks. But remember, this 10-mark question, if we remember back to the mark breakdown, is 6 KAA marks and 4 evaluation marks. And with this question, all these objectives, what diagram do they relate to? That monopoly diagram. You can show the revenue max, the sales max, of course the profit max, and that is really, as long as you include it in your analysis, that is where you pick up the KA marks from. So 100%, the first thing I pretty much do with this question is draw out the monopoly diagram, and yeah, we'll demonstrate here. So, of course, with the monopoly diagram, we have cost less revenue on the y-axis, just write it out in your exam, and quantity on the x-axis, D equals AR curve, MR twice as steep as your AR curve, the nice little AC, and MC. And now let's get into the nitty gritty and label up these points. So of course, always start with the first one, which is profit maximization, which is where I want to draw that a bit differently, where MC equals MR, which is of course this point here. Then how do we work out the price where we profit maximize? We go up from that point there, and then we go left. This will now give us P max, and that quantity there will be Q max. And now we go up from Q max to find our box of supernova profit. So we go up from Q max until we hit our AC curve, and that is our box of supernormal profit. Bang. So that is our first objective, and that's pretty much the main objective you're going to be speaking about. Maybe here do 2 paragraphs, one about profit maximizing, and then one about a different objective. The other objective I would pick, you can either pick sales marks, you can pick revenue mark, but the one I would pick, just due to this little mention in the extract, which is maximizing long-term returns, I would pick sales maximizing, because when we're sales maximizing, of course, we're trying to make as many sales without making a loss, and the whole aim of sales maximizing is to increase market share. So if we're trying to increase the long-term returns for the shareholders, likely in the short run we're pursuing sales maximizing, trying to maximize the market share in the short run, and then like I said, in the long run we move back to profit maximizing, meaning that we use that market share we've built up, and then we can almost exploit consumers. Now we have that loyal fan base, that loyal market share. And where do we find sales maximizing? Sales maximizing is of course found, remember what I said, it's where a firm maximizes sales without making a loss, which of course would be where D equals AR is equal to AC. And just for a bit of understanding that can actually be used in your bigger essays, maybe a 15-mark question comes up on this, or a 25-mark question comes up on this. Why is sales maximizing where AC equals AR? Because remember, what is AC? AC is cost per unit. What is AR? AR is average revenue per unit. Therefore, if we produce at any higher quantity, the average revenue, basically the price of the unit, drops below the cost per unit. Thus, we're making a loss on each unit. So this is why sales max is the maximum we can produce without making a loss on each unit. And then, of course, just work out the price for sales max. So just put P, sale, whatever you want to put, and then Q, sale. And the way you could do this is, again, using the application we picked up. First paragraph, you could disagree with this statement. You could say, I disagree that the main objective for firms is profit maximizing, as in the short run, to boost market share, firms will sales max. And then just, of course, include the diagram, use it in your chain of analysis, explain what sales maxing is step by step. And then your second paragraph, you'd say, then you can say, I agree that firms in the long run will profit maximize, as they will use that increased market share they have gained from sales maximizing in the short run to then exploit consumers, I don't know, make these large boxes of supernova profit in the long run. And as long as you have those 2 separate references to the extract, picking up your 2 application marks, that is more than enough for those 6 KAA marks. And then, of course, for this question, you do have your 4 evaluation marks. So the first thing that pops to mind is actually the extract. And like I said, whenever you're evaluating, always try to use your extract. Is this mention here that we're saying that the firm's main objective is to profit maximize, when in reality, most of these firms are struggling to stay in the business. So therefore, their main objective may not be profit maximizing. It may just be like remaining in the market, trying to survive in the market. So you could say, however, in evaluation, this depends on whether the firm's main objective is not profit maximizing due to harsh market conditions and is actually just remaining, staying in the market. And the massive one we did plan but we haven't mentioned, you could say, how in evaluation, this depends on whether a firm is profit satisfying, as they may make a certain amount of profit to satisfy shareholders, then pursue other objectives. For example, Microsoft spending, I don't know, 100 million on planting trees or like environmental objectives. So just like a little example, that's 100% a valid evaluation. But of course, there are other evaluation points, like a great one, of course, would be divorce of ownership and control. But yeah, anything here, as long as you have 2 points, even one really developed evaluation point, you will pick up those 4 evaluation marks. And yeah, that is all I have for the 10-mark question. Let's have a shot at the 12-mark question. And the first thing I see is the golden words and exactly what you want to see. I want you, in your exam, if you see this, just at least smile, just be happy. Use a cost and revenue diagram. So using a cost and revenue diagram. Now, if your 12-mark question, you can go back and watch the video I have on 12-mark questions, going in depth on it. I go a bit more in depth than this, but a TLDR, if you get a 12-mark question which it explicitly states it uses this wording, using a cost and revenue diagram, this means you can pick up all 8 marks, so all 8 of your KA marks, by just drawing the cost and revenue diagram. As long as your diagram is accurate, you've shifted whatever they need you to shift, you've got a decent chain of analysis, it's the fastest and the easiest 8 marks you'll pretty much get for any 12-mark question. So using a cost and revenue diagram, discuss the likely impact of rising costs for coffee shops on their profitability. And now, since this is talking about rising costs, cost and revenue diagram, the one rule you need to remember is when there's an increase in variable cost, both increase. So both your MC and your AC will increase. Whereas if there's an increase in fixed cost, only your AC will increase and your MC stays the same. That's just a rule you can need to remember. It is on the flashcards on the You Do Econ website. But yeah, let's have a look at which one is specifically telling us is increasing, and it's referring to extract A, line 2. So let's have a look at that. So line 2 would obviously be here. So line 2 is here apparently, so my bad. So they've experienced rising costs, but basically we're trying to find why there are rising costs, and the next paragraph does actually tell us that. So rising wages, that's one of the reasons for the rising costs. So minimum wage increasing and rising rent. And to class these in fixed versus variable, of course, wages would be a variable cost, rising rents would be a fixed cost. So that basically means I'm just going to shift them both up, since the question, I think they will let you in this question, since they've mentioned both, they will let you shift just AC up. So if you're talking about fixed costs, but they won't mind if you shift them both up, since they have mentioned variable cost. So it doesn't matter which one you do, just make sure you shift either one of them up. So yeah, let's draw this out. Okay, of course, just like before, cost, revenue, quantity. I always, with my cost revenue diagrams, I always did it in the same order, just so it just meant consistency for me. So D equals AR, MR, AC would always be my third curve, and then MC would always be my fourth and last curve. So if I was literally doing the exact same thing every single time, so it meant that I would basically never make a mistake, and I never did. So now, of course, we said there's an increase in variable costs, so we're just going to shift the AC up like that. For the sake of the video, I know you can't do this in the exam, I'm going to use red just to make it a bit more clear. So AC moves up there, and then MC, again, what is the rule with MC? MC has to intersect AC at its lowest point, and remember, you do need to follow that. I probably should have annotated the first one before I did this, but let's quickly just level up the profit maximization points. So MC equals MR there, then we go up to our AR curve, so let's just get the box super normal profit, or super normal profit. I'm going to label this number 1. So that is our box of super normal profit before. But let's make sure this fully labelled so we do not drop any marks. That would of course be P marks, and this I'm going to label this Q marks. Now let's find the next box of supernormal profit. Just works the same way, and I actually need to label these correctly. So MC1, AC1. So now where did firm's profit maximize? Where MC equals MR, which would of course be at this point here now. So yeah. So you need to make sure, do not slip up on these small things. MC1 is here, but MR is still here, so it still would be at this point. So now let's go up to our AR curve, which of course is here, and then go left. So this is now our price. So I'm going to label this Pmax1, and then what do we do? So let's label this Qmax1. How do you find our profits or maybe our losses in this scenario? We go up from Qmax1 until we hit our AC curve, and in this scenario we are still making a of course, relatively much smaller box of super normal profit, but we are still making a box of super normal profit. And that's exactly what they want you to comment on in the chain of analysis. So whether in your diagram, whether you're making a loss with maybe if your AC was somewhere up here, you would be making a loss. But whether you're making a loss or the box, and of course the box of super normal profit will be smaller, whatever you do, because you have shifted the AC up. That's exactly what they want you to comment on. Quote these points, say prices have changed, and the main thing is that the box of super normal profit has shrunk. Why? Because costs have increased, and of course, how do we make? What is the formula for profits? Profits are revenue takeaway costs. Therefore, since our cost has increased, it means that the overall profit has decreased. And of course, include your application why. So we said that variable costs have increased, and here it actually mentioned what's happened with variable costs. So talk about the 6.2% increase in national minimum wage has caused this effect on cost, and that's why you should hope for a question like this. That is all 8 marks boxed off, as long as you just write a small bit, include a bit of application, then like I said, talk about the increase in the variable costs and what it causes, just compare the relative boxes of super normal profit, and that is all you need for your 8 KAA marks. Then of course we do have 4 evaluation marks, so let's try pick them up. So the best evaluation point I can think of off the top of my head, it actually relates back to labour markets. I think it's one of the factors that determines the supply of labour, which is the percentage of costs it makes up for a firm. So here we've said the increase, what was it, 6.2% increase in national minimum wages is going to cause costs to increase massively, basically. So AC is shifting up a lot, MC is shifting up a lot. But however, a great evaluation point, and the way I would word it is, however, in evaluation, this depends on the percentage of costs that wages that workers make up, as if they are a relatively small percentage of a firm's costs, they will therefore not shift AC up as much, or to a smaller proportion, they will shift AC up, thus meaning that the effects on profitability will not be anywhere near as large, thus negating the negative effects of the increase in costs. And then of course, what usually happens when there's cost increases, and that is an absolute banger of an evaluation point. But then also on the opposite side of the spectrum, what do we say what is profit made up of? Profit is revenue take away costs. Now, when firms' costs increase, what as consumers do we usually see? We see firms increase their prices. So therefore, if costs have increased for firms, they're likely to increase prices. Thus, if prices increase, what is the revenue formula? Revenue is price times quantity. So essentially meaning that, yes, firms' costs have increased, but in line with the costs increasing, the revenues are likely to increase, as they're likely to pass that increase in costs, pass it on to the consumer. Thus meaning there might actually be no effect on profitability. I just want to make sure that makes sense. So as consumers, when firms' costs are rising, so for example, when the price of oil was rising, when the price of gas was rising, we saw a massive boom in household energy bills. But for example, so like we said, firms' total costs are rising. Therefore, how are firms likely to respond to these total costs rising? The firms' costs are rising. What are they likely to do? They're likely to increase prices. Therefore, if they increase prices, their revenue is likely to go up. So yes, even though a firm's costs are increasing, it's likely that the revenue will also increase, thus meaning that the negative effects of total cost increases are likely to be negated by the increase in total revenue. So almost they just balance out. The increase in costs could be balanced out by the increase in revenue, and that works as a really good evaluation point. So the way I would word the evaluation point is, however, in evaluation, the decrease in profitability depends on the increase in total revenue after a firm increases its prices. And then explain why a firm would increase prices, maybe include that bit of real world application that I mentioned, whatever you know of real world application there, and then it works as a really good evaluation point. And those, even one of them two, is more than enough to pick you up those 4 out of 4 evaluation marks for your 10 mark question, for your 12 mark question, sorry. Okay, so the 50 mark question. With reference to the information provided, discuss whether the coffee shop market is contestable. Okay, so this is actually a very easy question, and let's go about breaking this down into a step-by-step manner. So, a market being contestable, what characteristics make a market contestable? Now, this isn't something you learn in the spec, it isn't something you learn on a flashcard, it's just kind of using your brain. So what makes a market contestable? If a market is contestable, it essentially means it's easy to enter, it's easy for new firms to join the market. And what determines the degree to which a market is easy to enter, it's easy for a new firm to enter? And that is a concept we call, essentially, barriers to entry. Now, if a market is contestable, of course, one of the characteristics is going to be low barriers to entry. But in the spec, you should learn, and it is one of the flashcards on the You Do Econ website, cheeky plug, but you should learn 4 barriers to entry. Well, there's 4 main barriers to entry, and these 4 barriers to entry is what I'm basing my answer on. And since it's a 50-mark question, pretty much what I'm going to do is one KA paragraph agreeing, so I'm going to agree with that the coffee shop market is contestable, and one paragraph disagreeing that the coffee shop market is not contestable. So the way I'm going to do that is, let's go through the 4 barriers to entry. So number 1 is, of course, legal barriers, and I actually have a full video on this on my channel. I'm pretty sure it was probably uploaded sometime last year, but I 100% do have a video on the different barriers to entry. But yeah, legal barriers. And what are legal barriers? These are more relevant in like tech industries, but things like patents, copyrights and trademark. Then our second barrier to entry is sunk costs. So these are costs that cannot be recovered if a firm leaves the market. Something like training a barista is a sunk cost. Why? Since once they've trained that barista, if they have to leave the market, they can't exactly get that money back. They can't get the money back where they've spent training the barista, maybe sending him to getting someone to coach that barista. That money's never going to be returned, basically. And something like advertising is another example of sunk costs. But then our third barrier to entry, and a big one, and pretty much probably what one of my paragraphs is going to be focused on, is economies of scale. If you remember back to the extract, we talked about in the first question, actually, the 3-firm concentration ratio. I think we worked it out to be about 53%. That shows these large firms, which was Caffè Nero, Costa and Starbucks, I believe, they're going to have massive economies of scale, whereas these smaller independent shops, so with these large economies of scale, they're able to reduce their longer average costs, charge lower prices, therefore they're a lot more competitive than the small firms. These, like we said, there's loads of small independent stores where, of course, they do not have these barriers, they do not have these economies of scale, therefore have higher costs, therefore have to charge higher prices, which reduces their competitiveness relative to the large incumbent the 3 big firms. But then, of course, just thinking again, this is all just from reading the extract. In evaluation, remember the extract does mention about quality over quantity, where these independent firms are still surviving and are still in the market since they provide better quality, a better atmosphere, just a better overall like quality for the consumer. Therefore, they are still receiving demand. But yeah, that is our third barrier to entry. Then our fourth and our last one is something very relevant to the coffee shop industry, which is brand loyalty. So I'm sure, and I know many people who are very loyal to a specific coffee shop, and one component of brand loyalty is something like loyalty cards. And places like Caffè Nero, I'm pretty sure most of them have it, but I don't really go to many of the others. But Caffè Nero, I think it has, if you buy 10 coffees, one of them's free. I'm sure Starbucks and Costa have something similar. But yeah, these things like loyalty cards obviously increase the degree to which individuals are loyal to their brand. And why are loyalty cards so clever? It's firstly keeps consumers coming back, keeps consumers demanding, and then more importantly, it keeps them away from rivals. So it keeps them away from Costa, keeps them away from Starbucks, which is of course exactly what these firms want. Okay, so I'm going to use these 4 barriers to entry to shape my arguments for basically my 4-point and my against point. So my 4-point being the market is contestable, and my against point being that the market is not contestable. So for saying that the market is contestable, I believe, of course, is a 50-mark question. You are going to have to use a lot of application. So let's have a quick look over the application. So the main one that springs to mind is them saying somewhere that like independents are very risky to the big, where is it? It's somewhere in there. Yeah, so here. Independent coffee shops remain a threat to branded coffee shops. So that, of course, these are small independent shops. They're nowhere near as big as these large incumbent firms. However, they still pose a risk, which 100% does prove the point that this coffee shop market is contestable. And I probably would link this to the barrier to entry of legal barriers, since in the coffee shop market, like I said, it's not really a tech industry. There's not really many trademarks, copyrights, patents. Like you can't trademark a process of making coffee. You can't trademark coffee, essentially. Therefore, that is definitely one thing that makes it more contestable than other markets. For example, a tech industry like entering the Hoover, or like the whatever it's called. I think it's called Hoover. So like Dyson, you can't enter Dyson's the hoovering industry, as Dyson have massive patents, have massive trademarks over those goods. Whereas coffee industry, one thing that makes it contestable is definitely the legal barriers. And then I guess you could mention sunk costs. But this is totally dependent, as some costs could be quite high versus could be quite low. For example, renting a shop floor is of course getting cheaper as high streets are doing worse. For example, high street shops are nowhere near as popular, as relevant in the modern day with, of course, the expansion of online. Thus, you could argue on one point for your 4 paragraph could definitely be that the sunk costs for coffee shops are lower, since setting up a physical shop it's much cheaper. However, you could obviously evaluate that and argue the opposite, saying in the most high footfall locations in popular cities, rent is still extremely high, thus meaning that sunk cost of this firm joining the market is still very high. And proving that the market is contestable is the harder paragraph, I believe, as the uncontestable side of things. So the against paragraph is a lot easier. And why? Because let's just have a look at figure 1. What does this show? What do we work out? Costa, Starbucks and Caffè Nero, 3 firms, have a concentration ratio of around 53%. That is an obvious indicator that this market is not contestable. And then even in the extract, it mentions how Coca-Cola has taken over. Of course, Coca-Cola, massive monopoly power. They could just invest lots of money. They could start pursuing things like predatory pricing, forcing smaller firms out of the market, so really decreasing the contestability in the market. And things like economies of scale, and this links perfectly to that concentration ratio. Since these firms, I'm pretty sure it mentions how many shops they have. So it mentions that they have 2,681 shops Costa has. And that really can show, it shows the extent of economies of scale. Since I have so many shops, think about things like materials, raw materials, like even coffee. The amount of coffee they're ordering, they can use things like purchasing economies of scale as or you might have heard of it as bulk buying economies of scale, where a larger size of the order leads to increased negotiating power, increased bargaining power. Thus, they can reduce the price. Thus means lower cost, lower LRAC, meaning that of course it increases that profit margin. And then even things like equipment, like of course coffee is made in coffee machines. For the 3 large incumbent firms, they're able to get a much lower price per machine as they have, again, purchasing economies of scale. And then I always suggest students, whenever you talk about economies of scale, talk about purchasing and then also technical. So with technical, so they can invest maybe in the best coffee machines, the fastest turnaround for coffee, so if they can serve more customers at once. And by serving more customers at once, that also does help the customer experience. Why? They're in and out there quicker, as everyone they don't want to spend 10 minutes queuing for coffee, and it could lead to better quality coffee, better tasting coffee for customers. So there's lots of benefits of these economies of scale. And then of course we said brand loyalty, another massive thing that shows this market is not contestable. Why? A small independent coffee shop can't exactly have the same brand loyalty as somewhere that has 500 stores. Why? Since a customer, they can go anywhere across the UK and find a Costa, find a Starbucks, whereas can they go anywhere across the UK and find a local coffee shop? No. So yeah, definitely the brand loyalty is another massive thing that increases the barriers to entry, therefore makes the market uncontestable. And for your 50 marker, of course you do have your 6 evaluation marks, but here you can pretty much pick and choose. So I've presented to you loads of points here. You can pick and choose which ones you use as points for and against. And basically, some of the points you don't use against is really good evaluation for the point for. So both of these points work as, so both these paragraphs basically work as evaluation for the other paragraph. So maybe if you haven't mentioned brand loyalty in your against paragraph, you can use that as evaluation for your for paragraph. But yeah, evaluation here should be really easy. And yeah, a really good question and a really good revision for your content knowledge on contestability. And this is what I try to emphasize to students. The reason why in my live classes I try to emphasize content mastery so much and go into deep detail with certain topic areas, certain spec points, is because questions like this, if you don't know what barriers to entry is, even though it's, of course, market structures is a massive topic, but barriers to entry is a small spec point in market structures. But if you do not know your barriers to entry in detail, it is going to be extremely difficult for you to get anywhere near 15 marks, and you will probably, without decent detail, limited to somewhere around 7 to maybe 5 to 7 marks, which is of course nowhere near what you need for an A and an A star. So 100% content mastery is key, and like I was saying, economics is a double-edged sword. You need to master your content and also master the exam technique. Easiest way to solve that, watch all the videos on this channel, attend the live classes, and you, if you put the work in, will get the A star. Anyway, that is June 2022, paper 1, section B done. Moving on to section C and the 25 mark questions. Okay, section C, June 2022, paper 1. Let's have a shot at this question. Evaluate whether a monopoly is likely to operate efficiently. Now, you should already know the answer in your head. I have a full video covering whether monopolies are efficient somewhere on my channel. I will try to link it down below, but back to the question. Refer to at least one monopoly of your choice, and this is especially why in Edexcel you need to have a really good depth of real-world applications. So here, you basically need to know a full monopoly in detail to be able to provide those application marks and to show your examiner you have the appreciation of real-world of economics, and is the reason why I go into so much depth with application in my live classes. So the stem tells us about Tesla, which is actually a really good example of a monopoly, and an example I would actually suggest you remember. I remember last year I did one, I think half an hour in a live class just on Tesla, because it's such a good example of monopolies. There's lots of good examples like Tesco, even things like Amazon, Apple. Lots of great examples of monopolies. So Tesla had held 82% market share in electric vehicles in the US during the first half of 2020. But back to the question. So the question is basically asking us for and against points for why monopolies are either efficient or whether they're against which they are not efficient. Now, like I said, you should already, by your content knowledge, like I always say, content mastery is key. You should already know the answer here, but it's just about bringing the answers and planning them out on the paper now. So, of course, one of the main things where monopolies do act efficiently is, of course, dynamic efficiency. So to answer this question, for some of you that maybe can't remember or need to do a bit of revision on this, let's draw out that classic monopoly, cost and revenue diagram, quantity, and let's see how monopolies interact with efficiencies. So like I always say, I always do my monopoly diagram in the same order, very systematic way to do it. Always AR curve first, then MR, then AC, and then MC. And of course, remember, MC intersects AC at its lowest point. We're profit maximizing at Q max. Then we go up there until we hit our AR curve, and then this would give us a box of supernova profit. Let's label this up. Okay, so what does this show us so far? So the first thing that should spring to your mind is dynamic efficiency. So one of the points for would 100% be dynamic efficiency. And what is dynamic efficiency? Dynamic efficiency is when firms that have large supernova profits invest this large supernova profit into research and development, which allows them to innovate, create new and better quality goods and services, which of course is to better outcomes for consumer, better quality products for consumers. You can say increased consumer surplus, and allows, like I said, allows innovation in the market. And that is 100% one of the massive advantages of monopolies. And specifically, if we're thinking about Tesla, where have Tesla shown this? Of course, Tesla have been a pioneer in the electric vehicle market. We've seen it with Tesla's batteries, and then the investment into self-driving, which is of course a totally new sector. And Tesla have been at the forefront, the pioneers of developing this new self-driving technology, which in the long run should actually improve consumer outcomes and improve quality of life for consumers. So yeah, one of the main advantages of monopolies, as they have, and let's go back to the actual question. What does it say? Why is there proof that Tesla is a monopoly? There's 82% market share. How would I introduce this in my question? I would define legal monopolies. So the definition of a legal monopoly is a firm with over 25% market share. Thus, Tesla has, of course, staggeringly higher number than 25%. Thus, it proves it is a monopoly. And they use this dominant power they have in the market, that monopoly power, to, of course, firstly, charge consumers higher prices, but then they invest that profit into dynamic efficiency, allowing these long-run better outcomes for consumers. And then a massively neglected point about efficiency is economies of scale. And of course, we are showing economies of scale as we literally have an AC curve drawn. And of course, as you can imagine, these large monopolies, they exploit these economies of scale. And like I always say to students, whenever you mention economies of scale, you need to mention, and I would always mention these two main ones, which are purchasing, so the bulk buying power reduces the cost per unit as you have more bargaining power. So as you're buying more units, therefore reduce cost per unit, reduce LIAC. Then technical, and of course somewhere like a monopoly like Tesla is 100% exhibiting both of these. Technical with investing into the newest machinery, which increases productivity, reduces cost per unit, and of course purchasing. And if we're talking specifically about Tesla, you might have heard in the news they have these things called gigafactories, which are quite literally the definition of economy scale. Absolutely humongous factories. They exhibit all the economy scale. They produce a massively large output, which, how do we actually define economy scale? When output increases, costs fall, and that is exactly what these gigafactories are. And that is how Tesla is showing an example of a monopoly acting efficiently with its economy of scale and using its gigafactories. So there's some really good 4 points, but now let's also think against. There is, of course, some other 4 points where basically, for monopolies acting efficiently, it's such a common question, is you should basically almost have a model answer for this. And I know one of my other points in my model answer would be cross-subsidization. And a great example of that, which I used to teach in my live classes, was Royal Mail. So, of course, if you think about Royal Mail, they deliver to the entire of the UK, and there's some areas of the UK which are highly densely populated, places like London, like cities, Manchester, where there's lots of people in a small area. So, for example, someone delivering mail can probably deliver to 100 households in maybe an hour. Whereas, and that is extremely profitable for them, since they can, of course, these works are more productive, they're getting more output per worker. But then if you have somewhere like the Scottish Highlands, where maybe it takes 40 minutes drive between like customers, between people that you need to deliver your mail to, of course the cost per unit is much higher. And that's a great example of cross-subsidisation, where Royal Mail uses its profits from its densely populated areas, so London and Manchester, where it has low cost per unit, and it uses that profit to subsidise supplying the like Scottish Highlands, areas which are like less densely populated. So that's another example you can write for Tesla cross-subsidisation, as they used to have a really expensive car. I can't actually remember what it's called. It's like a model something. And like the Tesla trucks, the Cybertrucks, very expensive Tesla model, but then they use that profit they gained from those Tesla Cybertrucks, and they use it to build the cheaper models. Now you see in the UK roads every single day, where I think they're called Model Y, something like that, which are basically the more cheaper, the more everyday alternative. They're called the Model 3 apparently. So they cross-subsidise from the higher expensive models to build these everyday, pretty much normal consumers can afford, which are the models like the Model 3. But now let's think about some points against, and this is where you can really utilise the diagram. So we talked about one of the efficiencies, which is of course dynamic efficiency. Now let's think about the other types of efficiency, which is allocative efficiency. And where do we find allocative efficiency? This is where MC equals AR. Now, let's see, are monopolies allocatively efficient? So essentially we're proving, is a monopoly allocatively efficient? So, like we said, it's at the point where MC meets AR. Now let's determine the price of allocative efficiency, which is P allo, then this will give us a quantity of Q allo. Now, this price is of course lower than the profit maximization price, and the quantity is higher than the quantity at where we profit maximize. Thus, this shows a monopoly is not allocatively efficient. As, of course, instead of pursuing the objective of allocative efficiency, a monopoly pursues profit maximization. And let's try for the next one, which is productive efficiency. Where is the point at where monopolies would be productively efficient? This is where MC equals AC, which is, of course, at this point here, the main mistake students make here is they will go straight left from there and say this is P prod, where in reality that is wrong. As remember, we always have to go up until we hit our AR curve. And now this will give us a price where we're productively efficient, so P prod, and of course that will be the quantity where we're productively efficient, which is Q prod. Now we can work out the little box of supernormal profit, but regardless of that, what does this show again? So the price is lower than the profit maximization price, and the quantity is higher than the profit maximization quantity, thus showing that monopolies are neither productive or allocatively efficient. However, they can be dynamically efficient. So that is a summary on monopolies' efficiencies. And that is essentially, you can either put into one paragraph or two paragraphs. That would be my against point. So they're neither productively or allocatively efficient. So now we've planned the details, let's actually talk about how we're going to structure the paragraphs. And the reason why this is so simple and so easy to me is because this is almost your bread and butter of your economics in year two. In year two, it's all about market failure, market structures. And these questions are so common, and you really 100% before your paper one, you need to almost have a model answer, just know how to answer these questions. So like this plan, of course, I've been teaching economics for years, but even as a student, I would know this pretty much off by heart. So if you get a question like this, you pretty much don't even have to think, and it's more just recall rather than having to come up with the points. Since, as I always say, especially in Edexcel, questions, they don't repeat, but they rhyme. So when these questions come up, they're very similar to previous questions, and sometimes they literally repeat. Like the common example of price discrimination questions literally come up exactly the same. Yeah, the wording's changed a bit, but the actual question stem itself is exactly the same. So for this question, I will do two paragraphs. And the way I would do it, so my topic sentence would be, I disagree monopolies are likely to operate efficiently, as monopolies, due to their profit maximization objective, are neither productively or allocatively efficient. And that would be my topic question. Topic sentence, sorry. Then of course, would draw in the diagram, and then I would put an example, something like what we were talking about with Teslas. So of course, as we know, there's the expensive Tesla models, and there's the cheaper Tesla model. I would say something like, G, Tesla profit maximizes or it charges high prices for its Model S's, I think, or its expensive models of Tesla. You don't need to quote, of course, the exact model, but you can just say Tesla has expensive cars where profit maximizes or it charges higher prices for. As remember, examiners, they need to see your appreciation for a monopoly and the appreciation of the real world of economics in this question for you to get anywhere near the 25 out of 25. Then I would go on to introduce monopolies, talk about how they profit maximize, so mention the diagram, talk through the diagram with the examiner, like I always say, assume the examiner has no content knowledge. So talk about MC equals MR, they find the price P max, and that is of course the profit maximization price, leads to this large box of supernormal profit, but then mention your efficiencies, your productive efficiency, your active efficiency, where they found the relative prices. Then just like we talked through with the explanation, talk about how the profit maximization price is higher than the productively efficient price and the allocatively efficient price, and then also talk about the quantities. You want to include this diagram and just squeeze everything out this diagram as much as possible to help you pick up the maximum amount of mark. And 100% the efficiency I didn't mention in the explanation, you could 1,000,000,000% mention X in efficiency. And what is X in efficiency? It's when a firm produces at a point above the average cost curve. And why could that happen to Tesla specifically? And the main thing here is in the stem. The stem mentions that Tesla has 82% market share. Now, try to ask yourself this question. Why is a firm like Tesla with 82% market share more likely to experience X inefficiency? And that is all due to the lack of competition in the market. Since they are dominating the market, there is less incentive for them to innovate. There's less pressure on the firm. Since they're the best, they're already the biggest in the market. Thus, there's less pressure for them to reduce costs, which leads to them not being as efficient as they can be, which is of course what X inefficiency is. So 100% another one that you can mention there, and that would be an absolutely perfect paragraph talking about why monopolies are neither productive or allocatively efficient, and then also you can mention X inefficiency. And of course, make sure to include this stat, as examiners will love that since they're using that stat in a really good manner. And this is a tip I usually give to my A-star students, but like I always say, if you watch all the videos on this channel, you put the work in, you attend the live classes, there's nothing stopping you from getting that A-star. It's achievable for every single student, and that's what I love about economics. But what I used to do for questions like this, where I used to know the plans. So for example, some questions, like I said, they repeat all the time. Before you do your paper 1, your paper 2, you should have already gone through these questions, done them a few times, so if it comes up, because they're common questions, you should already know kind of what you're doing. And for questions like this, what I used to do is, I didn't just use to plan, I used to specifically plan what would be my main paragraph, so what would be my KAA paragraph, and then what would be my evaluation. So I would label this 1A. 1A represents, that is the first KAA paragraph, and then I would label this 1B, and the 1B would represent, that is the evaluation to my first paragraph. So 1A is my first KAA, then 1B is my evaluation to my KAA. And that just meant, as I already had my whole plan done within the first, 3-4 minutes of my exam, I already knew what my paragraph would be and what my evaluation would be. So you can just imagine how organised, how well written these essays were, and I encourage every single student to do this as well. So I've done my analysis, my whole analysis on monopolies, and not productivity, or X efficient. Then what am I going to try for my evaluation? And this is why this plan is so great. Now I'm going to evaluate with saying, however, in evaluation, this depends on the degree to which monopolies are dynamically efficient. Now, why is this the best evaluation point? This is as it's the most specific to your answer, and that's why I emphasize to students as well. And once you've gone past the barrier of just being able to evaluate, the best evaluation and the one that is going to pick you up the most marks is the one that is most specific, the most related to what you've written in your KAA. And that's why I always tell students, when you're evaluating, always read through your chains of analysis first, try and find any limitations, any assumptions you've made that you can evaluate, as they directly relate to your question, and they're not just general evaluation points. So in my whole paragraph, I've been talking about how monopolies are operating inefficiently, but then I'm going to evaluate this by saying, however, in another world, or however, in evaluation, monopolies can actually be dynamically efficient. So my whole paragraph, there's a constraint of my entire paragraph. So I've just kept banging on that monopolies are inefficient, but then I've evaluated by saying they're efficient, and that's why it's a perfect evaluation point. So the way I'd word it is, however, in evaluation, this depends on the degree that a firm can be dynamically efficient. Or in specific, this depends on the degree to which Tesla is dynamically efficient. As Tesla profit maximizes at MC equals MR, it charges price P max and quantity Q max. This leads to a large box of supernormal profit. Now, since Tesla is looking to innovate in the long run, trying to invest into research and development, thus meaning that due to this investment into research and development, it leads to this firm innovating in the future, creating better quality products for consumers, thus meaning this firm is dynamically efficient. As for example, Tesla has innovated the electric vehicle industry with better, higher quality batteries and innovating technology with trying to introduce things like self-driving, and that is an absolute perfect evaluation. You've banged on answered the question. You refer to a monopoly. It's the best evaluation point, the most specific for that paragraph you've written, and that is exactly, and it's even higher than A-star level. That is just absolutely perfect. And for my second evaluation point here, since we're talking about efficiencies and prices specifically, since the prices kind of determine whether the firm is operating efficiently or whether it's not, and that relates a lot to business objectives. So what my other evaluation point would probably be on the time frame. So I would say, however, in evaluation, whether monopolies are likely to operate efficiently depends on the time frame. As this changes between the short run and the long run, as you can talk about the divorce of ownership and control, you can just talk about how in the short run firms may have different objectives like sales maximizing, revenue maximizing, and of course you can show that on the diagram where MR equals 0, revenue maximizing, when AC equals AR, sales maximizing. But of course, in the short run they may be revenue maximizing. However, in the long run they may then pursue something like allocative efficiency, something like allocative or productive efficiency, thus meaning, yes, in the short run, they may be acting inefficient. However, in the long run, these monopolies may act efficient. And then lastly, one of the biggest evaluation points I always want you to remember with regards to monopolies, pretty much whenever monopoly is mentioned, this should pretty much work as an evaluation point, and that is this word. It is regulation, and of course regulation by the CMA. The way I would word it is, however, in evaluation, this depends on the degree of regulation by the CMA, as if the CMA catches Tesla or believes Tesla is exploiting consumers, it will therefore use its, of course the CMA wouldn't be in America, so whatever you just say the regulatory authority in America, but yeah, they would use their regulatory power to stop Tesla or whatever firm it is abusing their exploiting consumers, thus meaning Tesla may be forced to charge a more productively or actively efficient price, thus meaning the monopolies may not be able to act inefficiently. So basically, the regulatory authority may force the monopoly to operate efficiently. And that is my first paragraph wrapped up. And then for my second paragraph, so in my classical method, I would label this 2A. So for this is going to be my second KA paragraph, which I'd say, I believe, so the opposite side of the spectrum, I believe monopolies are likely to operate efficiently as these large incumbent monopolies experience extremely large or just large economies of scale. For example, this is seen with Tesla as they operate these massive gigafactories which help reduce Tesla's costs. And then for my chain of analysis, as Tesla increases output, this leads to a fall in its long run average cost. And you can see this on the diagram. I would literally draw as simple of a diagram as this, just economies of just a AC curve, and just showing just economies of scale. So as output increases, what happens to costs? Costs obviously fall, and then I would mention how costs fall until this circle. What does the circle represent? Of course, that circle represents the MES, the minimum efficient scale. And then Tesla also experiences technical economy of scale. As Tesla in these gigafactories invests into specialist capital, this helps increase productivity, helps increase output per unit time, thus meaning that Tesla's long-run average cost continue helping them experience larger and larger economies of scale, meaning that Tesla's costs continue to drop and the firm is acting efficiently, as therefore with lower costs it can therefore charge, and you don't really need to mention this, but you can, with lower costs it means therefore Tesla can charge its consumers lower prices and still make a profit. And then we've already mentioned dynamic efficiency, but you could, if you really wanted to, mention dynamic efficiency again. You could also mention the fact that with technical economy of scale, yes, the goods are getting cheaper to produce, but as they're investing into specialist capital, the quality of the goods are also improving alongside the goods are cheaper. So that means also consumers are getting better quality goods, better consumer outcomes, meaning that that is also very efficient for consumers. And that is more of a simple paragraph, but it's still a great paragraph nonetheless. And now moving on to evaluation. Now with economy of scale, again, this just comes with experience. What is the best evaluation for economies of scale? What is more specific evaluation for economies of scale? That would of course be DOS, which is, and I'm going to label this 2B. Why? Because this is diseconomies of scale. The way I'd word this is, however in evaluation, the degree to which Tesla or a monopoly is likely to operate efficiently depends on the degree to which a firm experiences diseconomies of scale. As when a firm grows, when output increases, it's likely that a firm will experience, and of course you can show this on the diagram, diseconomies of scale. And what are the 3 reasons? A decent acronym that sometimes your teachers will teach you. This is due to ABC, which is alienation, bureaucracy, and lack of communication. So essentially, when the firm gets too big, it takes a lot longer for example, the managers and the employees on the shop floor to communicate, and that lack of speed in the communication, that increased time between the managers who make the decisions and the employees leads to, of course, that also increased costs, for example. But since there's so much bureaucracy, so for an employee to report that to the manager, he might have to go through 10 sub-managers to get to someone who can actually change the prices or make a decision. That, of course, increased costs for firms, and just that communication time increased costs for firms. And then, of course, alienation with a small firm. Like if you think about a startup, some of you guys might know startups, everyone's aligned to one goal. It's almost like your own company where you really want it to succeed. You want the best for the company. You work overtime. You work overtime without even getting paid. But when you're operating a massive like transnational corporate, like basically just a massive firm, the employees are just there for the job. They're just there to get paid. They don't actually care about your company's vision. They just want to get paid, go home to their family. That's kind of what alienation means. These workers are not very motivated. They're not very aligned to your mission. As when a firm gets big, they have to employ lots of individuals, and not every single individual is going to be massively motivated and aligned to your goals. And yeah, that is a decent summary on that. And there are a few more evaluation points, but I can't go through every single thing. And yeah, that is how I would do my 2 paragraphs for this question. Of course, you would have a final judgment with your 25-mark questions. That is where any points you have not mentioned in your plan, I would mention them there. So here, cross-subsidization would work very well. That's just a little point introduced into your final judgment, mention a bit about it, and yeah, they pick up a few marks here and there as well. So that's also a very positive thing to do. But yeah, that is June 2022, question 7, and let's now move on to question 8. Okay, so moving on to the second question in this section C. So evaluate the factors that might influence the supply of labour in an occupation of your choice. Again, Edexcel are almost screwing you if you don't know any real world application. So like I always say, it's of utmost importance for you to know industries, you to know examples of basically everything. So you need to have a really good depth of real world application. Let's see what the stimulus is talking about. UK facing large labour shortages, hard to fill vacancies like software engineers, construction workers and nurses. Now this is an example I usually teach in my live classes since there's so much depth in it with regards to labour markets, and this is a really good example that I would learn, and we'll go through a bit of this as well. But now, just as a general tip, of course this is for revision, so I would 100% attempt this question, but in your exam, or if you're doing any mocks, I would never pick a labour markets question, since let's look at the 2 choices we have here. We have an absolute... Now, of course this is for practice, and I would always suggest practice all questions. Do not neglect any question, since you don't know what's coming up in your exam. But now, since you have a choice, and if this was your real exam or your mock, you have an absolute gem of a question. One that is going to be very easy for you to write as much chain of analysis. You can write loads, really good evaluation. And then you have a labour markets question. Yes, labour markets question, it is a decent question, but are you, as a student, what are you more confident with? Where do you feel like you can write more chains of analysis, more in-depth, more evaluation? 9 out of 10 times I would be picking this, but 100%, that does not mean neglect practicing labour markets, but I would just spend a bit more time on the monopolies, on the market structures, on the market failures, since if a question does pop up on them, you should be picking them, since that is where, if you've done more work on it, and it's more, as if you've done more work on it, you should score better. And since these are the more popular questions, they come up more, these are the ones that should be prioritising, practicing more. What factors influence the supply of labour in an occupation of your choice? And of course, like I said, we're going to pick nursing in the UK. But the main factor, and the first one that should come to your mind, is the most obvious one, but a lot of students do forget it, is of course the relative wages. Okay, we're going to go more into depth with wages later on, but I want to paint the picture so it'll all come together in one. So one of the factors that influences supply of labour is definitely wages. And with nursing, another factor that affects supply of labour is definitely skills. So with nursing, for example, you usually have to do like 3 years of degree level, or just a degree, to get into nursing. You have to register with the equivalent of the GMC, so that you have to register with an official body. It's a regulated body to become a qualified nurse. So this, like I said, 3+ years of training. Now, let's think how that affects the supply of labour. So if the wages of nurses went up massively, would the supply of nurses go up massively? No. So what does that mean? That means the supply of labour is not responsive to a change in price. Thus, that just suggests inelastic supply of labour. And why is that? Since it takes 3+ years for nurses to train. So therefore, if the wages of nurses went up, there wouldn't magically be hundreds of thousands of new nurses appear randomly, as it would take time for these nurses to train. It would take time for these nurses to be that time lag between the wages increasing and new nurses being trained would mean that therefore, in the short run at least, there is inelastic supply of labour. And how would we show that? Of course, on a labour diagram, we have wage on the y-axis, and then we have quantity of labour on the x-axis. And the inelastic supply of labour would, of course, look something like this, just like an inelastic demand or an inelastic supply curve. It's just steep. So we've talked about the inelastic nature of nurses' supply. Now let's investigate further, and let's think about their demand. Whenever you think about elasticity in labour markets, always think about how they would respond to a change in wages. So let's give the example that nurses' wages increase. So how would that affect the elasticity of demand for nurses? And remember, in labour markets, firms are doing the demanding and workers, us households, are doing the supplying. So if nurses' wages increased, what would be the elasticity of demand for nurses? So we expect, if there's elastic demand for nurses, we would expect an increase in wages will lead to a significant or a proportional decrease in the demand for nurses. However, in reality, will this happen? No, it can't happen. Why? Because nurses are an essential service. If the NHS don't have nurses, its hospitals, its the NHS itself cannot operate. And there are very few substitutes for nurses themselves, as the NHS can't just hire untrained workers to fill that role. Therefore, that would suggest if wages did increase, the NHS would not be very responsive, especially in the short run, to a change in wages. Thus meaning, so if there's inelastic demand and inelastic supply, what does this therefore mean? It leads to a high equilibrium, well, a relatively high equilibrium wage for nurses. But now, in the real world, does that hold true? Does it hold true? Would you say nursing is a high-paying job? If you've ever read the news, if you know anything about nursing, that is very untrue, and it's quite opposite, that nurses are definitely underpaid and things like overworked. But why is that? So if they have inelastic supply of labour and inelastic demand of labour, economic theory would suggest they would lead to a high equilibrium wage. But then why are their wages so low? And this is the exact concept of monopsonies, and more specifically, the NHS's monopsony power. So, of course, what does a monopsony mean? It's when there's one dominant buyer of labour in the market, and this, in the UK, of course, is the NHS. And with Edexcel, you do not need to, it does not explicitly state on the spec that you need to know the monopsony diagram, but it totally depends when you're watching this video, I would say. If you're watching this video 2-3 days before your exam, which I know a lot of you will, do not learn the monopsony diagram. It's not that high yield that you need to learn it. You should focus more on just overall everything. If you're watching this well in advance, maybe a couple of weeks, maybe even a couple of months before your exams, 100% I would suggest learning the monopsony diagram. It's not on your spec, but it still adds a lot of depth to your essay, and you can be credited if you use it well. So, and a lot of times either students will learn it and they think it's definitely on the spec. If you're like cramming and you need to prioritize what to learn, the monopsony diagram is not on your spec. If you just make sure you know the theory behind it, you do not need to know you don't need to exactly know the diagram. But if you have that buffer, if you've been putting the work in throughout the year, 100% monopsony diagram is a good one to know. Anyway, I'm getting a bit off topic here. This is not ultimately very related to the question. So the way I would do it, by the way, with this question, I'm just trying to explain the case study to you, since of course lots of labour markets questions will be worded differently, and that is a very, very good case study and a very good thing to know. But for my first paragraph, I would do wages, and then just talk about how in the nursing industry there are low relative wages, and then just mention how the low relative wages, the low equilibrium wages, affect the supply of labour. Of course, with low wages, it's all to do with incentives to work. If there's low wages, there's low incentive to work, thus meaning that nurses will supply less labour, meaning that there's like a shortage of labour in the nursing market. And that's how I'd word the paragraph. I probably would not mention the monopsony power. That is just more to do with that case study. And then for my second paragraph, I would have mentioned the high relative skills in nursing, as it takes 3+ years of training. Talk about how this leads to inelastic supply of labour. I probably wouldn't actually even mention demand, because again, it's nothing really to do with this question. Just talk about how like what I explained before, why there is inelastic supply of labour, as if wages increased due to the extensive years of training required, there would not be a proportional response to an increase in wage. So there would not be a proportional response of supply of labour to an increase in wages, thus suggesting inelastic supply of labour, of course, meaning inelastic supply of labour, basically. And for this question, since your paragraphs are probably not going to be too much in depth, since there's not actually that much to speak about, I would do a third paragraph, which would be on non-pecuniary benefits. These are things like non-monetary benefits, like job satisfaction, which of course in nursing, since you're helping humans, is quite high, but then the pressures of the job do wear that down. So you can mention that things like working conditions, the very poor working conditions would, of course, no sort of benefit. It's a negative, isn't it? It would definitely reduce the supply of labour. Career progression, social status, all those things would come under non-pecuniary benefits. Write a paragraph on that and talk about why that would lead to, how that would affect the supply of labour. And then, of course, I would relate it to nursing, and most of those are going to be very bad for nursing, since the NHS is not the best with the working conditions of nurses. But yeah, and that's pretty much how I'd answer that 25-mark question. Now, one thing students really struggle with labour markets is evaluation. So I'm going to run through a few evaluation points just generally. So for example, if these two paragraphs are quite big, they're quite chunky, you've got a decent chain of analysis, you can actually use non-pecuniary benefits as a evaluation. So if you're saying something like low wages is going to lead to a low supply of labour in the nursing market, you can then say, however, in evaluation, this depends on the non-pecuniary benefits, as the job satisfaction is very high for nurses, since they are helping individuals. Obviously, you just neglect a bit of information. It's very high for nurses as they're helping individuals, thus meaning that the non-pecuniary benefits may outweigh the low wages. And one I mention everywhere is always time frame. So in the short run, there might be a lack of supply of labour, but then it depends on government policies. It depends if the government increase things like apprenticeships, bursaries, like training schemes, that could massively increase the supply of labour, and it's a factor that affects the supply of labour. And a big thing specifically with nurses, another valuation point, is definitely migration. There's a massive percentage of nurses that used to come into the UK from Europe. So post-Brexit, that has obviously been massively affected, since the laws and the regulations with workers moving between Europe and the UK have changed massively. So post-Brexit, there's been a massive undersupply of nurses from Europe, which is one of the main reasons why the UK NHS is struggling with the undersupply of nurses. So you could say, how in evaluation, this depends on the levels of migration, or again, depends on levels of government policy, as if they alleviate the policies, maybe reduce the regulation or alleviate the constraints for nurses moving between Europe and the UK, it could again improve the supply of labour. And then of course conclude that all with the final judgment. Anything you haven't used in your plan, use it in the final judgment. But yeah, that is a wrap on Edexcel Paper 1 2022. On to the next paper.